And then the last two I'll go through very quickly. Economic persecution and severe discrimination. Discrimination isn't alone a reason for or proof for persecution in the asylum context. But an inability to travel safely anywhere in the country is a type of discrimination that limits your life in such a way that it rises to the level of persecution. Forced expulsion from the country, obviously, is a type of persecution because behind that is the violence of perhaps death, depending on how you can prove that, that rises to the level. Deliberate imposition of a substantial disadvantage, and that means, you know, the inability to find any type of work at all. As opposed to on the right side of the column, lack of opportunities to practice your own profession. There have been cases where a person can't practice dentistry, but that doesn't mean that the person is able to prove persecution based on not being able to work. You just can't be a dentist, which is discrimination, but it doesn't rise to the level of persecution in the US case, if I'm not mistaken. But that wouldn't rise to the level of persecution. Back on the left side, being outcast from society as an HIV positive person, it depends on the degree of being outcast, but there was a case that a person lost their job, was turned away from the hospital and forbidden to marry, and that was enough to prove persecution that rose to a significant level. Rather than, oh wait, did I put that in the wrong column? Recurring and overt discrimination that does not seriously restrict the right to livelihood, practice religion, or access to education is not persecuted. So there's kind of the balance there. And then severe criminal extortion. It also depends just on the extent of the extortion. Threatening to disclose sexual orientation in a sufficiently hostile environment, and there you have the same test as you would for proving that you've been persecuted, or proving future persecution based on sexual orientation. If someone's threatening to out you in that circumstance, then that could go toward your persecution claim. But just criminal extortion alone without that extra risk of violence wouldn't. I won't go into a lot of details, I only have a minute left, but persecution context, especially in the UK, has basically hit a crossroads where over the last 15 years, a woman named Jenny Milbank, she's a professor in Australia, has done a lot of research on credibility and the fact that in Commonwealth countries, so and common law countries actually, the US included, the UK, Australia, and Canada, it's been much harder over the last 15 years to prove your identity and belonging to a particular social group. So that's generally a particular social group. It's been even harder for people to prove that their sexual orientation or is the reason for persecution, or that their gender nonconformity is the reason for persecution. So our work deals with the last 15, 20 years, and in the last couple of years in the UK, it's gotten even worse because, because there was a decision by the Supreme Court of HT and HJ, which basically said that the discretion test for being discreet about your sexuality as a way to maintain your ability to stay in your home country and your responsibility to do that, that was eliminated. So now, if a person, well, it's kind of more complicated than it sounds, but if a person is realistically thought to reasonably want to and have the intention to remain discreet, then they can stay in their home country, but they don't have a responsibility to remain discreet, which means the discretion test for asylum is gone in the UK, which mirrors the guidance note, I think the spirit of the guidance note from the UNHCR in 2008, and where I think the EU would like to go. Unfortunately, this has caused pushback from the asylum authorities who have made it a lot more difficult to actually prove your sexuality. So there's a case of a guy from Tanzania who was rejected on the basis of credibility. His name is Eddie Cosmas. And some of the reasons he was rejected were he didn't remember exactly when Pride was the year before, and he couldn't define a relationship in the way that they were looking for. So they asked him how many relationships he'd had, and he said 2. And then they asked him how many one-night stands, and there was a guy he'd slept with more than once, and they said, well, isn't that a relationship? And aren't you aware of who you're having a relationship with? And it was really turning it in a way that relied on those types of stereotypes. And I like what you said about the stereotypes. that that's not how people are trained, and it is probably it's disparate in the UK. I think some of the UK border agents are taking these decisions to heart and really thinking critically about it, but there are an awful lot who are really just using these stereotypes about sexual behavior and sexual orientation, the expectations of what people should be doing, to invalidate people's narratives about their sexual orientation. So the result, as I put at the bottom, is credibility usually cuts people's claims off now before they even get to the persecution question. So the persecution question kind of gets summarily dealt with. And on top of it, a lot of cases are getting fast-tracked, so people don't have time to really produce a narrative that's coherent enough or in the right frame for the immigration officials. So that's the state of affairs in the UK, at least, and be interesting to see what it's like in the US, because I'm not as familiar with the credibility shift in the US. So, and at the end, I just put a few websites that I tend to turn to for some of this information. Obviously, there's also Ref World and a bunch of others, but those are the ones that I thought of.